She had crossed 11 days of flooded trails and punishing storms to reach a man who might send her back before she even stepped off the wagon. Evelyn Cross stood at the edge of Red Bluff Ridge with torn clothes, a broken trunk, and nothing left to hide behind. No elegance, no composure, no carefully rehearsed first impression. Just a woman too tired to pretend she wasn't terrified. The man watching her from the porch hadn't moved. And then a small voice cut through everything. A child's voice, barely a whisper, landing with the weight of something much larger. "Please be our mama." If you've ever arrived somewhere completely undone and found something waiting that you didn't expect, stay with me. Like this video and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach had been sitting in the mud for close to 20 minutes before the driver finally gave up trying to free the rear wheel himself and climbed down to dig. Evelyn Cross didn't complain. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight against the wooden bench, watching the other two passengers. A traveling merchant and a man she'd decided early on was either a lawyer or someone pretending to be one, shift and grumble as if the delay were a personal offense. She kept her mouth shut. She'd learned that on the second day, somewhere between the flooded creek crossing in eastern Missouri and the stretch of trail that turned into a shallow river for nearly 4 miles, you didn't spend your breath complaining about things that wouldn't change. What she did do, quietly, in the small hours of the morning when the coach rocked and the other passengers slept, was unfold the letters. She had 3 of them, all from the same hand. Nathan Rowe, Red Bluff Ridge, Colorado Territory. The handwriting wasn't elegant. It crowded the right margin like the man didn't entirely trust he'd said enough, then stopped abruptly as if he'd run out of patience for his own words. She'd read them enough times that she could have reconstructed them from memory alone, but she still read them, not for information, for something harder to name. The first letter was practical to the point of bluntness. 2 children. A working cattle operation. The house needs repair. I am not a man given to sentiment, and I won't pretend otherwise. She'd appreciated that, actually. She'd answered a dozen other advertisements before his, and most of the men wrote like they were describing property. The acreage first, the livestock second, themselves somewhere after the well depth. Nathan Rowe had written about the children first. That was the thing that made her write back. The second letter was shorter. My daughter asked me what you looked like. I told her I didn't know. She said that was fine, she'd find out herself. I don't know what to make of that, but I thought you should know. The third letter had arrived only 6 days before she boarded the eastbound train to catch the westbound stage, and it said almost nothing except, I hope the journey isn't too hard. Red Bluff gets cold at night even in May. She'd folded that one and put it in her coat pocket instead of the others, and she still didn't entirely understand why. The trunk was the first casualty. It happened somewhere in the second week, on a downslope after a creek crossing that should have been manageable, but wasn't, because 3 days of rain had turned the bank into something that didn't hold weight. The coach lurched, recovered, lurched again, and when Evelyn climbed out at the next stop to check the luggage strapped to the back, the metal latch on her trunk had snapped. The lid was held shut with rope the driver had offered without being asked, which she'd accepted without the thanks she actually felt, because she was too tired to feel much of anything by then. She'd repacked what she could. The blue dress, the good one, the one she'd planned to wear when she arrived, was crumpled now beyond recovery without an iron. The small mirror she'd wrapped in her second shawl had broken anyway, which she decided not to treat as an omen. The leather-bound reader she'd brought for the children had gotten damp at one corner but dried without warping, which felt like a small mercy she was willing to take. What she couldn't recover was the image she'd spent weeks constructing in her head. The one where she arrived composed and capable, where Nathan Rowe looked up from whatever he was doing and saw a woman who had her life under control. That version of the arrival had dissolved somewhere around day 7, in the middle of a rainstorm that soaked through her coat in under 10 minutes, and she'd made a quiet kind of peace with it. She would arrive as she was. He would see what he saw. That would be the truth, and she'd rather start in the truth than spend the next year trying to catch up to a fiction. Red Bluff Ridge was smaller than she'd imagined. She'd pictured something more. Not a city, nothing so grand, but a town, at least, with a proper main street and a general store, and enough people moving through to give a place the feeling of permanence. What the stage deposited her into was a scattering of buildings around a wide dirt road, a livery stable that needed paint, two structures that might have been storefronts and might have been storage, and a woman on a porch across the road who stopped sweeping to watch the stage with the unself-conscious attention of someone who didn't get much entertainment and didn't pretend otherwise. Evelyn was the only passenger disembarking. The driver handed down her damaged trunk and her smaller bag without ceremony, said something about the next run coming through in 3 weeks, and climbed back up. She stood in the road and watched the stage move off and felt, for about 4 seconds, an emotion she couldn't afford, which was the very clear sense that she had made an enormous mistake. Then she picked up her bag, put her hand on the rope holding her trunk closed, and looked around. The ranch was north of town. Nathan's letters had said that, a mile and a half up the north trail, you'd see the red rock formation that gave the place its name, and just past that, the house. She was trying to calculate whether her trunk could be left somewhere and collected later when she heard the wagon. It came from the north road, moving at a pace that suggested someone who wasn't hurrying but wasn't dawdling either. A particular kind of purpose that she'd associate with him later is simply the way he moved through the world. 2 horses, a flatbed wagon, and Nathan Rowe on the bench with 2 children beside him. She recognized him from the photograph he'd sent, which had been taken at some formal occasion and made him look uncomfortable in a way the real man, apparently, was not. In person, he was taller than she'd expected. Or maybe it was just the way he sat, upright without stiffness, the kind of posture that doesn't come from trying. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of weathered face that Colorado gives men who work outside. And he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which she decided later was just his face. Not unfriendly, not distant, simply not performing anything. He pulled the wagon up and set the brake without speaking. Then he climbed down, and the 2 children climbed down after him. The girl scrambling quickly, the boy with the careful deliberateness of someone older trying to seem even older. Nathan Rowe looked at her standing there with her broken trunk and her damaged traveling clothes and her hair that had lost any pretense of the arrangement she'd pinned it into 2 days ago, and he said, "Miss Cross, you made it. Not you look tired, or that's a rough journey, or any of the dozen other observations that would have been accurate. Just the fact of the thing, stated plainly, like an acknowledgement that the hard part was over." "I did," she said. It wasn't eloquent. It was all she had. Check. The girl was 6 years old and apparently operated on a different set of social conventions than anyone else present. While Nathan was lifting Evelyn's trunk into the wagon, and the older boy, Thomas, he'd be introduced as Thomas, 9 years old and already practicing the art of not showing what he thought, stood at a polite distance, Maisie walked directly up to Evelyn and looked at her with the frank assessment that only very young children and very old people manage without self-consciousness. "Your dress is torn," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Did you fall down?" "Once, and there was a branch." Maisie considered this. "Papa tears his clothes too sometimes. He just sews them back up." "That's a good approach. Can you sew?" Evelyn looked down at this child with her sun-darkened face and her 2 uneven braids, done by a man's hands, clearly, competent but not quite even, and felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't prepared for. "I can," she said. Maisie seemed to find this satisfactory. She reached up and put her hand in Evelyn's, not asking, just doing it, with the confidence of someone who had already decided, and then turned toward where her father was finishing with the trunk. And then, in a voice that was quieter than anything else she'd said, a voice that seemed to understand it was saying something that mattered, "Please be our mama." Evelyn Cross, who had crossed 11 days of flood and storm and mud and cold, who had kept herself together through all of it by sheer deliberate will, felt the tears come before she could stop them. She pressed them back. She didn't cry, but it was close. Nathan had heard it. He'd gone still with his hand on the tailgate, and when he turned and looked at Evelyn, he looked like a man who had just had something confirmed that he wasn't entirely sure he'd believed before. He didn't say anything. He helped Thomas up to the wagon bench, then offered Evelyn his hand to climb up, a gesture so ordinary and unforced that she almost missed what it was. She took it. The ranch was larger than the town. That surprised her, though she wasn't sure why it should have. Nathan's letters had been specific about the acreage, 400 acres, working cattle, A small vegetable plot his late wife had started that he'd kept going with varying success. What the letters hadn't conveyed was the sense of space, the way the land opened up past the Red Rock Formation and rolled out toward the foothills in a way that made you feel simultaneously very small and, oddly, less afraid. The house itself was solid, built to last rather than to impress. Practical windows, a porch that ran the full width of the front, a roof that had been recently repaired on one side and needed repair on the other. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a woodpile that was better stocked than Evelyn would have expected for mid-May. She cataloged all of this automatically, the way she'd cataloged everything for the last 11 days, as information to be understood and adapted to. Nathan pulled up to the porch and helped the children down, then turned to offer his hand again for Evelyn. She climbed down carrying her small bag and stood in the yard of the Rowe Ranch for the first time, looking at the house that she might be living in for the rest of her life. "House is warm," Nathan said. "I started the stove before we left. There's water heating." She turned and looked at him. "You might want to clean up before I show you around," he said. "I can take the trunk to the room." He paused, then added, with a specificity that told her he'd thought about this. "It's the room at the end of the hall. Used to be—" He stopped. "It's got a good window." He didn't finish the sentence, and she didn't ask him to. "Thank you," she said. "That would be welcome." The room at the end of the hall had a good window. It faced west, which meant the afternoon light came in at an angle that turned the pine floorboards gold. There was a bed with a quilt, a washstand, and a small table with a chair, and on the table someone, she suspected Maisie, had placed a wildflower in a tin cup. Evelyn set her bag on the bed and stood there for a moment, not thinking about anything in particular, letting the stillness settle over her. Outside, she could hear Nathan in the yard, and the children's voices, and somewhere a cow complaining about something. She unpacked what she needed. She washed her face and hands and the back of her neck with the warm water Nathan had provided, and she looked at herself in the small mirror she'd managed to keep intact, and saw exactly what 11 days of hard travel produced. A woman who looked 10 years older than she was, and approximately 0% like the competent, presentable person she'd planned to arrive as. She fixed her hair. She shook out the least damaged of her dresses, which was the brown one, and changed. She put the blue dress, the torn one, the one she'd planned to arrive in, at the bottom of the bag. Then she went out to meet the household properly. Dinner was a revelation and a diagnosis simultaneously. Nathan cooked. That was the first thing. He cooked without self-consciousness, without making any gesture toward the strangeness of the situation, simply because it was 6 o'clock and there were children to feed. What he produced was edible, and no more than that. Beans and salt pork and cornbread that was slightly heavy on one side, which Maisie pointed out without judgment, and which Nathan accepted with the patience of a man who had heard this before. The table itself told a story. The children had places that were clearly theirs. Maisie's chair had a carved notch near the base that she rested her foot in like a habit, and Thomas sat across from her in the chair positioned slightly closer to his father. The empty place was at Nathan's left, and Evelyn sat in it with the awareness that she was occupying a geography that had been empty for some time. Maisie talked. She had the unfocused, abundant quality of a child who stored things up and released them in unpredictable sequence. And over the course of dinner, Evelyn learned that the brown mare was named Butter, because Maisie had named her when she was 4 and thought it was a good name, that Thomas had gotten a splinter last week and wouldn't let anyone touch it for 2 days, that the chickens had stopped laying as much and no one knew why, and that there was a dog named Birch who was old and slept most of the time but was, according to Maisie, the best dog in the territory. Thomas didn't talk. He ate neatly and watched Evelyn with a sideways attention that reminded her of certain children she'd taught, the ones who were paying closer attention than they let on, who were making up their minds about you from a distance before they committed to anything. She didn't push it. She'd learned early in teaching that trying to win that kind of child over directly was the surest way to lose them. Nathan said, "Thomas has been helping with the cattle since March." "He knows what he's doing," Evelyn said, directly to Thomas. Thomas looked at her fully for the first time. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. Nathan, she noticed, had watched that small exchange. After the children were in bed, Nathan and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when children are sleeping. A softer silence than empty silence, still occupied. Nathan turned his cup in his hands. Evelyn waited. "I should tell you some things," he said. "About the arrangement. What I can provide, well, what I can't." "All right. The ranch turns a profit most years. Not a large one. Enough to maintain the operation and keep the family fed, with some reserve for hard years. I'm not able to promise you comfort in the way you might have had in Ohio." "I'm a schoolteacher's salary 2 years out from being a widow," Evelyn said. "Comfort wasn't the standard I was measuring against." He looked at her. "What were you measuring against?" She thought about it honestly. "Steadiness," she said, "but something that holds." He was quiet for a moment. "I can tell you I'm not going anywhere. That's about the extent of what I can promise. The rest of it, I don't know yet." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. Not romantic, not reassuring in any performed way, just a man telling her the truth about what he knew and what he didn't. "That's more than most," she said. Nathan nodded. He turned his cup again. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pines at the edge of the property with a sound like distant water. "Maisie," he said, and stopped. "I heard her," Evelyn said. "She doesn't—" He paused, and she could see him choosing words with the care of someone who didn't spend them easily. "She doesn't understand the difference between what she wants and what's possible. She decided something about you before you arrived." "Based on what?" "Based on the fact that I was writing to someone." He looked at the table. "She's been waiting for—" She doesn't say it, but she's been waiting for someone to come back. I don't know how to fix that." Evelyn looked at this man with his careful words and his tired face and his 2 children sleeping down the hall, and she thought about the small hand in hers on the road and the wildflower in the tin cup and the braids that weren't quite even. "You don't have to fix it," she said. "That's not how it works." He looked up at her. "Grief doesn't get fixed," she said. "I know that from experience. It just gets company." Nathan Rowe looked at her for a long moment, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was unusual for her. She'd been reading people for a living for 7 years, but his face was like the land out there. It gave you information if you were patient, but it didn't rush toward you. "Her name was Clara," he said finally. "She died 14 months ago. Fever, and then complications from the fever. It went fast." He said it with the practiced flatness of someone who had said it many times. The way you repeat something until the words stop doing what they did the first time. "The children were—" Thomas was 8. He remembered enough. Maisie was 5 and didn't remember enough, and I'm not sure which is harder. Evelyn nodded. "I'm not—" He stopped again. "I'm not asking you to replace her. I want to be clear about that." "I wouldn't be able to," Evelyn said. "That's not what I'm here to do." "Then what are you here to do?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about Ohio, about the empty classroom at the end of the term, about the particular silence of a house that had held a husband and then didn't, about 11 days on a road that kept trying to stop her. "I'm here to be useful," she said, "and to find out if useful is enough to build on." Nathan looked at her for another long moment, and then, for the first time, something changed in his face. Not a smile exactly, something that was considering a smile from a careful distance. "It's been my experience," he said, "that useful is more than most people bring." That night, in the room with the good west window, Evelyn lay in the dark and listened to the Colorado Territory settle around her. The creak of the house, the distant sound of cattle, the wind through the pines. She thought about Maisie's hand in hers and the specific weight of it. She thought about Nathan's face when he'd said she's been waiting for someone to come back. She thought about Thomas's sideways watch across the dinner table and how he'd looked at her fully, just once, when she'd acknowledged what his father said about him. She thought about the room at the end of the hall, with its good window and its wildflower in a tin cup, and the care that had gone into that small gesture from someone who barely knew she was coming. She wasn't who she'd planned to be when she arrived. The carefully rehearsed competence, the composed first impression, all of it had dissolved somewhere in 11 days of mud and rain. What she'd arrived as was just herself, tired, a little afraid, truthful by necessity, and they'd opened the door anyway. She turned onto her side and watched the moonlight move across the pine floor, and thought that maybe arriving as yourself, stripped of everything you'd tried to bring, was its own kind of beginning. Not the beginning she'd planned, the one she'd actually been given. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 11 days, she slept without the rocking of the coach underneath her, and without the anxious arithmetic of what was coming. Just the dark, and the wind, and the sound of a household breathing around her. It was the first night of the rest of whatever this was going to be. She didn't know yet what to call it, but it had a west window, and it had let her in. The first week nearly broke her, not the way she'd expected, not in some dramatic, visible collapse, but in the small, accumulative way that hard things actually break people, one unremarkable hour at a time. Evelyn had come prepared for difficulty in the abstract. She told herself on the stage, through all 11 days of it, that frontier life would be demanding, and she was ready for demanding. What she hadn't accounted for was the specific texture of it, the way demanding felt different when it never stopped. She was up before the children every morning, which meant she was up before 5, which meant she went to bed with her hands aching and her back saying things to her that she tried not to listen to. The stove needed feeding at 4:30, or the kitchen would still be cold when Maisie came padding out in her socks. And cold kitchens at Red Bluff Ridge in late May were genuinely cold, not the polite chill of an Ohio morning. The water had to be hauled from the well, which she learned to do without complaint but not without effort. The bucket was heavier than it looked, and the path had a slope to it that caught you off guard. Breakfast, then the children, then the list of what needed doing, which was never shorter at the end of the day than it had been at the beginning. Nathan worked the cattle operation from first light and didn't come in until the work was finished, which was rarely before midday, and sometimes not until well past. He wasn't avoiding the house. She understood that. The ranch was what kept them all alive, and it asked everything he had. But it meant that for the first several days, Evelyn was largely alone with the house and the children and the particular chaos that the Rowe household had settled into over 14 months without Clara. Chaos wasn't quite the right word. It was more like drift. The kind of disorder that accumulates when someone capable is suddenly absent, and the people left behind are doing their best but don't quite know what the whole system looked like from the outside. Nathan kept the children fed and the cattle operation running and the woodpile stocked, and she could see the effort in all of it. But the house itself had been sliding, dishes put away in the wrong places, or not put away at all. Mending piled in a basket that had apparently been growing for months. The vegetable plot behind the house still breaking ground, but weedy at the edges, surviving on whatever attention could be spared for more urgent things. A window latch in the hallway that didn't catch right and banged against the frame when the wind came from the northwest, which it did most nights. Evelyn didn't make a list. She just started. She fixed the window latch first because it was the kind of small annoyance that wears at people and nobody notices until it's gone. She found a hammer and a small nail in the toolbox on the porch. A real toolbox, well organized, which told her something about Nathan, and had it done in 10 minutes. That night, when the wind came, the hallway was quiet. Nathan noticed. He didn't say anything, but she saw him try the latch when he came in from the barn, and something in his posture changed, a small loosening. The mending basket she approached with more caution. Some of the clothing in it was Clara's, she was fairly certain. A woman's blouse folded carefully on top, as if placed there deliberately rather than dropped in. She set it to one side and touched nothing that she wasn't sure about. What she did mend were Thomas's 2 school shirts, which had tears at the elbows that had been too long ignored, and Maisie's dress that had a split seam along the side, and a pair of Nathan's work trousers with a knee that had given out and been left to give out further. She did it in the evenings, after the children were in bed, by lamplight, and she didn't announce it. Thomas noticed his shirts the morning after she mended them. He picked up the second one and looked at the elbow for a moment, running his thumb over the stitching. He didn't say anything to Evelyn, but at breakfast he ate without the careful watchfulness he'd been using on her since she arrived, and that felt like more than words would have. Maisie, by contrast, had things to say about everything. She was 6 years old and interested in Evelyn with the complete undisguised intensity of a child who has decided you're important and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. She followed Evelyn through the morning chores, asking questions that ranged from practical to philosophical, without any apparent awareness of the difference. Why do you fold the blanket that way? Did you have a dog in Ohio? Why did you come here? Did you know our mama? Is your hair really that color, or is it different? Evelyn answered all of it. Mostly she answered plainly, because Maisie seemed to prefer plain answers over elaborated ones. On the dog, no, she hadn't had a dog. Her landlady in Ohio hadn't allowed them. On whether she'd known Clara, no, she hadn't. She'd only known about the family through the letters. On her hair, yes, this was the actual color, though it looked different in different light. On the question of why did you come here, Maisie asked it on the third day, while they were hanging washing on the line behind the house, in a tone that suggested she wasn't being challenging, just genuinely curious. Evelyn thought about it for a moment before she answered. I wanted to be somewhere I was needed, she said. Maisie handed her a clothespin and thought about this. We need you, she said, with the easy confidence of a child stating a fact. I know, Evelyn said. I'm figuring that out. It was honest. She was figuring it out, what being needed here actually meant, what shape it took on a daily basis, how different it was from what she'd expected, and also how much more than what she'd expected. She'd thought she was coming to be useful in a domestic sense, to fill a practical gap. What she was finding was that the gap was larger and more complicated and more human than practical. The children needed someone present, not performing presence, actually present, paying attention in the specific way that children know the difference between. Thomas needed someone who didn't crowd him or demand things he wasn't ready to give, but who also didn't pretend he wasn't there. He needed to be seen without being scrutinized. Maisie needed a great deal, and she needed it openly and without apology. And the main thing she needed was for someone to stay. Evelyn understood that. She understood it in her bones, actually, because she knew what it felt like to have someone not stay. Her husband had died 3 years ago, and she didn't think of it that way, as leaving, as not staying, because it wasn't a choice he'd made. But the body understands abandonment and death through the same language, and you have to relearn the difference slowly. Maisie was relearning, so, in a different way, was Nathan. She discovered this on the 4th day, accidentally. She'd gone out to the vegetable plot in the afternoon while Maisie was napping. Maisie still napped, emphatically, and fell asleep like someone dropping a stone, to clear some of the weeds from around the bean seedlings, which were being choked and doing their best anyway. She was working along the far row when she heard Nathan's voice from the barn, which was close enough that sound carried. He was talking to the horse. Not in the way people talk to horses when they're working around them, the absent murmur you use to keep them calm. He was actually talking, in full sentences, and she understood after a moment that he'd been going long enough that this wasn't something he'd just started. She couldn't hear all of it, and she didn't try. She went back to the weeding, but she caught enough to understand what she was hearing. A man saying the things he couldn't say in the house, to the one audience that couldn't repeat them or look at him differently afterward. She heard his name. I keep thinking, Clara, I keep thinking I'm supposed to know what to do. And then she deliberately moved further down the row, pulling weeds with more attention than weeds required, and let him have it. When he came out of the barn 20 minutes later, she was still in the garden, and he walked over and looked at what she'd done with the rows. Bean seedlings were getting choked, she said. I noticed that 2 weeks ago, he said. Didn't get to it. There's a lot of things on that list. There are, he said. He crouched down and looked at the cleared row, then at the ones she hadn't gotten to yet. I'll do the rest. I don't mind. I know you don't. He looked up at her, and there was something direct in it. But the garden was Clara's project. I should be the one to see to it. She stood back. Of course. He started working down the next row, and she started to move away, and then he said without looking up, she'd have had it in better shape than this. Evelyn stopped. She would have had it producing by now, he said. He pulled a weed, looked at it, set it aside. She had a gift for it. I don't. I just try to keep it alive. Keeping it alive is something, Evelyn said. Barely. He didn't say it with self-pity, just fact. She hesitated, then said, My mother had a garden. In Ohio. She was the same way. Things grew for her that I couldn't keep alive for a week. She paused. She said the secret was just paying attention. That plants tell you what they need, you just have to be willing to look. Nathan was quiet for a moment, working down the row. Then, what happened to her? Your mother, She died. 8 years ago. Fever. She said it with the same practiced flatness she recognized in him, the thing that happens to the words when you've said them long enough. My father the year after that. And then my husband 4 years later. She stopped, because that was probably more than he'd asked for. But Nathan had stopped working. He was looking at her. You lost all of them, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment, and she couldn't read his face entirely, but she could read enough. And you still got on the stage. She thought about the question underneath that. What it took to lose that much and still decide to move toward something. I didn't have a better idea, she said. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite grief, but was something in between. He went back to the weeding. She picked up her basket and headed back toward the house, and neither of them said anything else about it, but something had shifted between them that was small and real and not nothing. The hardest day was the 8th. Thomas came in from the yard with his hand wrapped in his shirt, holding it against his chest in the way of a boy who has decided he's not going to show how much something hurts. He sat down at the kitchen table while Evelyn was making bread and put his wrapped hand on the table and looked at the wall. Let me see, Evelyn said. It's fine. Thomas. He looked at her. She waited. He unwrapped his hand slowly, and she saw the gash along the base of his palm. Not deep enough to be dangerous, but significant and dirty, which was the more immediate concern. She got the basin and the clean cloth and the bottle of carbolic solution Nathan kept on the shelf. She'd found it there on the second day, and made note of it, and brought them to the table. Thomas watched her do all this without speaking. How did it happen? She asked. Wire, he said, on the fence. Your father know? He's out back. She read that. No. Does he need to know? Thomas considered. Probably. We'll tell him at dinner. She dipped the cloth. This is going to hurt. I know. She cleaned the wound. Thomas made no sound, which told her more about him than he probably intended. The kind of boy who had learned early that showing pain made people worry, and he'd decided he didn't want people worrying on his account. It was the kind of thing that developed in children who'd watched a parent be sick. She wrapped his hand firmly with a strip of clean cotton, and when she was done, he looked at it for a moment. You're good at that, he said. I had students in Ohio who were rough on themselves, she said. You learn. He was quiet. Then, did you teach older kids or just little ones? Mostly 8 to 14, she said. One-room school. All of them together. That sounds hard. It had its moments. She started cleaning up the basin. You'd have been in the middle of the group. Thomas seemed to consider this, himself as a student she might have had, how that might have worked. Were you strict? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I was fair, she said. Some of my students would say that's the same thing. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost, and that was its own kind of progress. Nathan came in from the back porch for water and saw Thomas's wrapped hand immediately. He looked at Evelyn and she said, Fence wire, clean, wrapped. He should be careful with it for a few days. And Nathan looked at his son with the expression of a father trying to calibrate between concern and the need to not make a 9-year-old feel managed. Does it hurt? Nathan asked. Not much, Thomas said. Nathan looked at the wrapping, looked at Evelyn, and she saw what passed across his face, something that was gratitude, but quieter than that, more worn in, the kind of feeling that comes from having someone else carry a part of the weight without asking to. Thank you, he said to her. Of course, she said. It was the simplest exchange they'd had. It was also, she thought, one of the more important ones. By the second week, a routine had started to emerge. Not the one she'd planned or imagined, but an actual one, made from the specific materials of this household and these people and this place. She taught the children in the mornings, which had been part of the agreement from the beginning, but turned out to be where she felt most like herself. Maisie was learning to read with an enthusiasm that occasionally outpaced her patience, which made Evelyn think of certain students she'd loved best. Thomas was further along than she'd expected. He had his mother's reader, she'd discovered, and had been working through it alone. And what he needed wasn't instruction so much as someone to read with, someone who took it seriously. They read together one afternoon, all three of them on the porch because the light was good, Thomas with his reader and Maisie with her primer and Evelyn in the chair with her mending, and it occurred to her that this was the most ordinary thing she'd done in years. Ordinary in the way that only becomes visible when you've gone a long time without it. Nathan had come around the side of the house and stopped when he saw them, and Evelyn hadn't looked up right away, and when she did, he had already turned back toward the barn. But she'd seen his face in that half second, and what was on it was something she didn't have an easy name for. Later, after dinner, after the children were in bed, he said, "You're good with them." She was washing dishes. "I'm a teacher. It's what I know." "It's more than that," he said. She kept washing. "They're easy to be good with. They're good children." "They are," he said. "Then, that's not entirely my doing. That was Clara." He paused. "And it's partly them, partly just who they are." She turned around then. Nathan was at the table with his coffee, and he looked tired the way he usually did at the end of the day. But there was something else tonight, a willingness to be here, at this table, with this conversation, instead of going to bed the way he often did. "You're harder on yourself than the evidence supports," she said. He looked at her. "How do you mean?" "I mean, Thomas knows how to work and knows how to care for himself and still asks for help when he actually needs it. Maisie is difficult and spirited and also deeply kind. Both of those things came from somewhere." She turned back to the dishes. "You kept them intact through something that could have broken them. That's not nothing." Nathan was quiet for a long time. "You sound like you've thought about it," he said finally. "I've had 8 days to observe," she said. "And?" She dried her hands, turned around, and looked at him across the kitchen. A plain kitchen in a house that was solid and tired and trying, with a man who was all three of those things himself. "And I think I came to the right place," she said. "I wasn't sure on the road. I'm more sure now." Nathan looked at her, and this time she could read his face clearly enough. He wasn't sure whether to believe her or whether he wanted to believe her, which wasn't quite the same question. He was a man who had learned to be careful about what he let himself want. She understood that. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and it was a deliberate echo of what he'd said to her on the first night, and she knew he recognized it because something in him shifted. "All right," he said. Not as agreement exactly, as something more like permission. Permission to take that as real. He finished his coffee and said goodnight and went down the hall, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, listening to the house around her. The window latch was quiet in the hallway. The garden was a little cleaner. Thomas's hand was wrapped and would heal. Maisie had fallen asleep with her primer open across her chest, which Evelyn had closed and set on the table before she covered her up. None of it was the story she'd planned to walk into. It was messier than that, and sadder in some places, and more complicated in others. But she thought about what she'd told Nathan on the first night. Grief doesn't get fixed, it just gets company. And she thought that maybe that was true of more than grief. Maybe the whole project of a life was like that. Not fixed, not made perfect, just given company, day by day, until the weight of it became something shared enough to carry. She turned off the lamp and went to the room with the good west window, and the tin cup on the table still held its wildflower, dried now but still there, which seemed to her like a small and adequate kind of promise. The gossip arrived the way most things did in Red Bluff Ridge, through the general store. Evelyn had gone in on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week, with Maisie at her side and a list in her coat pocket, to pick up flour and salt and the particular kind of thread she'd run out of for mending. The store was run by a man named Garrett Hale, who was perfectly pleasant in the way of someone who has made pleasantness into a professional tool, and his wife Dorothea, who was pleasant in the same way for free. There were 2 other women in the store when Evelyn came in, both from the settlement's outer farms, both of whom she'd met briefly at the Sunday gathering 3 weeks prior. She remembered their names, Mrs. Aldrich, Mrs. Petty, because she made a point of remembering names. They greeted her. She greeted them. Maisie immediately went to look at the penny candy in the jar on the counter, which she was allowed to do but not allowed to ask for, a distinction she navigated by looking at it with intense longing and not speaking. Evelyn found her flour and was working down the list when she heard, from the back of the store, where Mrs. Aldrich and Mrs. Petty had moved to examine fabric, the particular drop in volume that meant a conversation had shifted into territory it knew it shouldn't be in. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The store was small. "Can't imagine Nathan Rowe thought it would be more than a practical matter," Mrs. Aldrich was saying. "He's a practical man. He needed someone to manage the household. That's the whole of it." "She seems capable enough," Mrs. Petty said, with the quality of a woman offering a fair point before taking it back. But capable and suited are different things. She's an Ohio school teacher. That's not the same as she arrived looking like she'd been through a flood. She had been through a flood, from what I heard. Still, a pause. Clara Rowe was from this country. She understood what it asked of you. This woman, she answered an advertisement. How long before the reality of it becomes more than she bargained for, and she decides Ohio wasn't so bad after all? The children are already attached, apparently. Maisie, especially. Which is exactly the problem, Mrs. Aldrich said, and her voice dropped further, which meant she knew this was the part that couldn't be defended openly. Getting those children attached to someone who's here on an arrangement. What happens when the arrangement doesn't hold? Nathan Rowe is going to be left picking up pieces twice. Evelyn set the flour on the counter with a care that was indistinguishable from her regular movements, and wrote the amount in her small notebook. Her face was doing what she needed it to do, which was nothing in particular. She'd taught school for 7 years. She knew how to have a face that gave nothing away while the rest of her was doing something else entirely. What the rest of her was doing was something she hadn't expected, not the hot flare she'd anticipated, not simple anger, but something more complicated, something that recognized the words and found them partially true. She was here on an arrangement. That was accurate. The question of whether it held was an honest question. The concern for the children was real, even if the delivery was cruel in the way that only honest cruelty can be. She collected Maisie from in front of the penny candy jar. Not today. And paid for her supplies and walked out into the May morning, and Maisie chattered about something she'd seen in the store window, and Evelyn listened with one ear and thought with the rest of her. But, guess. She didn't tell Nathan that evening. She told herself it was because there was nothing useful in the telling, and that was partly true. But she also knew that part of her was sitting with the question those women had put into words, and she wanted to understand what she actually thought about it before she brought it into the house. That night she lay awake in the room with the west window and thought about the word arrangement, what it held and what it didn't. The truth was that she had come to Red Bluff Ridge on practical terms. That was the structure of it. Two people who needed things writing letters until they thought the other might be able to provide them. The letters had been honest, she thought, or as honest as letters between strangers could be, which was honest in a curated way, the way you're honest when you know the other person is deciding something. She had been honest about her situation. He had been honest about his. They had both shown up to the arrangement as agreed, but 3 weeks in she thought about Maisie's hand in hers on the road and couldn't make it feel like a transaction. She thought about Nathan in the garden saying, "I keep trying to keep it alive," and couldn't reduce that to practicality. She thought about Thomas's almost laugh at the kitchen table and the way Nathan's face had looked when he'd come around the house and found them all three on the porch reading. The arrangement was the container. What was in it was something else. She didn't have a word for it yet, and she was honest enough with herself to know that not having a word didn't make it nothing. What she did know, what had sharpened itself into clarity in the dark, was that the thing Mrs. Aldrich feared, Evelyn leaving when the reality exceeded the expectation, was not going to happen. Not because she was certain of what this was or where it was going, but because she was not a woman who left. She'd learned that about herself through loss. The thing that grief teaches you, if you let it, is the exact shape of your own stubbornness. She didn't abandon things. She stayed and she worked and she figured out what staying required. That was, she supposed, a form of information about herself that Nathan Rowe deserved to have. She didn't get the chance to tell him in the way she might have planned, because 4 days later the town brought the problem directly to the ranch. It was a Saturday afternoon and she was in the yard with Maisie, who had decided they were going to plant something. Maisie had theories about the garden that Evelyn was mostly encouraging, when a wagon came up the north trail. 2 men, Garrett Hale from the general store, and a man she didn't know, heavy-set, with a watch chain visible across his vest even at a distance. Nathan came out of the barn, and Evelyn stayed where she was in the garden, because whatever this was, it was clearly Nathan's business. Maisie stayed beside her without being asked, reading the adult silence well enough to understand this wasn't the moment for questions. The man with the watch chain was named Doyle. She caught the name across the yard. He was, she gathered, from the county seat, some county function, something administrative. And he was speaking to Nathan with the particular courtesy of a man who has authority and doesn't need to display it because the authority will do the work. She couldn't hear everything. She heard the arrangement, The word again from this stranger, and registered formal partnership in county records, and the phrase people have raised questions about the nature of the household. Nathan's posture changed, not in a way that looked like anger exactly, more like a man standing up fully after having been at a slight angle. She put her hand on Maisie's shoulder and said quietly, "Go inside and check on whether Birch needs water." Maisie looked at her. "Please," Evelyn said. Maisie went. Evelyn walked across the yard. She came to stand beside Nathan without looking at him first, keeping her eyes on the two men, and she heard Nathan say in a voice that was flat and even, and not asking a question, "My household arrangements are my business." "Of course," Doyle said, with the warmth of someone who means the opposite. "We're not here to—" "No one is questioning your judgment, Nathan. It's more a matter of clarity, for the children primarily. If this is a permanent arrangement, the county would benefit from knowing the arrangement is—" He paused, selecting. "Formalized. It's a practical matter," Garrett Hale added, and he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable about it. "People want to know the household is stable. The children are known in the community." "My children are fine," Nathan said. "I have no doubt, but—" "You've been talking to the Aldrich woman," Nathan said. Neither man answered, which was an answer. Evelyn said, "What specifically is being asked?" Both men looked at her. Doyle's expression rearranged itself into something professionally neutral. Miss Cross, is it? We simply want to understand the nature of the— Is the question whether we are legally married?" Evelyn said. A pause. "It's a consideration," Doyle said. "We haven't been," Nathan said, and there was something careful in his voice, an awareness that he was saying something that had weight. "That's the consideration, then," Doyle said, and spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to look like helplessness. Evelyn looked at Nathan. He was looking at the two men, and she could see the muscle in his jaw working, and she knew what was happening in his head because she could follow the same calculation herself. This wasn't about them. This was about the children. Thomas and Maisie, who were known in the community, who would be known in the community for years, who would grow up in this settlement and be the children of this household, and what this household was would follow them. "Give us a few minutes," Nathan said to the two men. He turned and walked toward the barn without waiting, and Evelyn followed him. Inside the barn it was dim and cool and smelled of hay and horse, and Nathan walked to the far wall and put his hands on the beam and stood there for a moment with his back to her. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I came here to marry you," Evelyn said. That was the arrangement. The arrangement. He turned around. His face was doing more than it usually did, more visible, more unguarded, which she'd learned meant he was genuinely unsettled. "That's the word they used. That's what Hale told me 2 weeks ago, that people in town were saying it was just an arrangement, like it was a business transaction that was going to dissolve once it became inconvenient." "People have been saying that since I arrived," Evelyn said. He looked at her sharply. "You knew?" "I overheard something at the store." She met his eyes. "I didn't say anything because I was still working out what I thought." "And now?" She didn't look away. "I think what other people say about this is not the reason to make a decision either way. The question is what we think." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the careful composure he mostly showed, but something underneath it, something that had been working toward the surface for 3 weeks. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to understand I'm not saying it because of the men outside." "All right." He pushed off the wall and looked at her directly, the way he looked at things he was serious about. "I had an idea of who was coming," he said, "before you arrived. I had your letters and I had whatever a person builds in their head when they're waiting for something, some version of a person that isn't a real person." "That's natural," she said. "What I built wasn't you," he said. "The woman I imagined was, I don't know, softer, less certain, someone who would need more guiding." He paused, and she could see him working through it honestly. "And then you got off that stage, and you looked like you'd been through 11 days of hell, and you just stood there, like you were assessing it, like you'd already decided you weren't going to apologize for how you'd arrived." Evelyn said nothing. "The first day when Maisie said what she said, and I saw your face," he stopped. "You didn't fall apart. You pressed it back and you kept going. And I thought, that's not someone who came here because she didn't have a better option. That's someone who decided. I did decide, Evelyn said. I know. He looked at his hands, then back up. And then every day after that, the window latch, the mending, the way you handled Thomas's hand without making him feel small about it. The garden. He shook his head slowly, and it wasn't frustration. I kept waiting for the thing that would tell me what this actually was, whether it was someone doing a job or... He stopped himself. Or, she said, Nathan Rowe, who was not a man who spent words easily, stood in his own barn in the afternoon light and said, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, something changed for me. I don't know exactly when. It wasn't a moment, it was just... He looked at her steadily. I'd come in from the cattle and I'd see you at the table with the children, and it wasn't the relief of someone doing the household. It was something else. Something I didn't expect to feel again. The barn was very quiet. I'm not saying that to pressure you, he said, and his voice had the roughness of someone saying a true thing in front of another person for the first time. I'm not saying it because of the men outside. I'm saying it because if we're going to have a real conversation about what this is and what we want it to be, you deserve to know where I'm standing. Evelyn looked at him across the hay-scattered floor of the barn, this man who was careful with his words and careful with his feelings and had just spent both without apparent calculation. And she thought about the dried wildflower in the tin cup in the room with the west window, still there on the table where Maisie had put it 3 weeks ago. When my husband died, she said, I thought that was the end of that kind of thing for me. Not because I decided it was, but because grief has a way of making the future feel very far away. She paused. I came here because I wanted to be useful. That was honest. But useful wasn't the only thing I wanted. I just couldn't say the rest of it out loud until I knew whether there was something here worth saying it to. And now? He said. The same question he'd asked in the garden weeks ago. Now I think there is, she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said roughly, we could go to the county seat next week if you're willing. I'm willing, she said. This isn't... He stopped, started again. I'm not asking you because of Doyle and his county records. I know that, she said. He nodded, looked at the ground, then up. All right. They stood there in the barn for another moment, not with the ease of two people who had resolved everything, but with the different quality of two people who had told each other a true thing and were standing in the aftermath of it, adjusting. The men are still outside, Evelyn said. They are, Nathan said. You should go talk to them. I should. He didn't move immediately. Evelyn. She looked at him. I'm glad it was you, he said. That's all. I'm glad it was you that got off the stage. She held that for a moment because it was specific and undecorated and exactly the right thing, which was how she was learning that Nathan Rowe said the true things, without ornament, without effort toward effect, just plain and clear and aimed directly at what he meant. I'll be glad too, she said. Give me a little more time to be completely sure, and I'll be glad too. He almost smiled. Close enough. He walked back out into the afternoon, and she heard his voice, even and unhurried, telling Doyle and Hale that the matter would be formalized in due course, and that he'd appreciate the community keeping its attention on its own households for the time being. She stayed in the barn for another minute. She looked at the horses, who were indifferent to all of it, which seemed healthy. She thought about what he'd said. I'd come in from the cattle, and I'd see you at the table. And the specific way he'd said it, like a man reading from evidence he'd been accumulating against his own intentions. She thought, 3 weeks. That was all this was. 3 weeks of ordinary days and difficult work and small exchanges that added up to something she hadn't planned for. She thought about the women in the general store, how long before the reality of it becomes more than she bargained for. She thought about how to explain that the reality had not become more than she bargained for, but had become different than she bargained for, which wasn't the same thing. She'd bargained for useful. What she was finding was this, whatever this was. A man in a barn telling her the truth about his own feelings with the same plainness he used for everything else. Like the truth was just another thing that needed doing, and you might as well do it right. She walked back out into the yard. Doyle and Hale were climbing back onto their wagon, and Nathan was standing at the porch with his thumbs in his belt, watching them go with the particular stillness of a man who has made his position clear and is comfortable waiting to see if it holds. She came to stand beside him, and they watched the wagon move off down the north trail together. And after a moment he said, without looking at her, "Garrett Hale's a decent enough man. He just listens to the wrong people." "Most people do sometimes," Evelyn said. Nathan made a sound of agreement. Then, "I'll tell the children at dinner that we're going to the county seat. I don't want them hearing it from someone else." "Thomas will want to know why." "I know. He deserves a straight answer." Nathan looked at her then, and she saw what she'd come to recognize as his version of affirmation. Not a smile, not warmth performed for an audience, just a direct acknowledgement that she was right, and he knew it. "He'll get one," Nathan said. The afternoon was settling into early evening, the light going copper and long across the yard, and somewhere in the barn, Butter was shifting in her stall, and the old dog Birch had come out to the porch and was lying in the last of the sun. It wasn't a perfect moment. The ground was still muddy from the week's rain, and Nathan had a tear in his coat sleeve she'd noticed and added to the mending list. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already thinking about the flour she needed to start for tomorrow's bread. But standing there beside him in the imperfect workday late afternoon, she thought, this is what it is. Not an arrangement dissolving into something better. Not a story someone else was watching from a distance and deciding the ending of. Just two people who had told each other the truth in a barn, standing in their own yard while the day wound down. That was, she thought, a place to build from. They told the children that evening, after supper, before the dishes were done. Nathan had suggested waiting until the table was cleared, and Evelyn had said no. That waiting until everything was tidy felt like they were making the conversation into something formal, and formal was the wrong tone for what they were actually trying to say. So the plates were still there, and the remnants of the beans, and Thomas's cup with a little coffee he'd been allowed because he'd asked with the particular dignity of a boy trying to demonstrate he was old enough. Nathan said, "I want to tell you both something." Thomas looked up from his cup. Maisie, who had been dragging a crust of cornbread through the last of her beans, stopped. "Evelyn and I are going to the county seat next week," Nathan said, "to make the marriage formal, legal." Maisie looked at Evelyn. "Like a real wedding?" "There won't be much ceremony to it," Nathan said. "Just a record, a document." "But it means you're staying," Maisie said to Evelyn. It wasn't a question exactly, but it needed an answer. "It means I'm staying," Evelyn said. Maisie absorbed this, and then something in her face shifted, a releasing of something she'd been holding without knowing she was holding it. She nodded like a much older person, deliberate, satisfied. Thomas hadn't spoken. He was looking at the table, and Nathan said, "Thomas." Thomas looked up. "You have something to say. Say it," Nathan said. Not harshly. It was just how Nathan spoke to his son, with a directness that assumed the boy was capable of honesty. Thomas was quiet for another moment. Then, "Is it because of those men who came? The ones from the county?" "No," Nathan said. Thomas looked at him steadily, deciding whether to believe it. "It would have happened anyway," Nathan said. "The men just moved the timing." Thomas considered this, the particular way he considered things, privately, internally, with only the working of it visible on his face. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You want to?" he said. "Not just because of him. You actually want to." It was the most direct thing Thomas had said to her in 4 weeks, and it was also the most important question anyone had asked her since she'd arrived. She held it seriously, the way it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I want to." Thomas nodded once, slowly, and picked up his coffee cup. That was all. But it was the right all. The Thomas version of welcome, extended in his own time and on his own terms, which was the only version that would have meant anything. The morning they left for the county seat was gray and cold, with low clouds moving fast off the mountains that Nathan said meant rain by afternoon. He'd arranged for a neighbor, a taciturn farmer named Breckett, 2 miles down the South Trail, to look in on the cattle, and the children were going with them, because Nathan had decided that if this was a thing they were doing, it should be a thing the family did together. Maisie wore her best dress, which she'd informed Evelyn about the night before, in a tone that suggested this was a significant decision. Thomas wore his mended school shirts and did not comment on them, but he'd done his own hair and put on his good coat without being asked. The county seat was a town called Harlan's Fork, 12 miles south, big enough to have a proper courthouse and a hotel, and 3 establishments that sold liquor, which Nathan noted without particular feeling when they drove through the main street. Evelyn had not been there before. It was larger than Red Bluff Ridge, but smaller than anything she'd known in Ohio, and it had the particular quality of a frontier town that was trying to become a real town and wasn't sure yet whether it would make it. The courthouse was the most permanent-looking building on the street. Stone, 2 stories, with a flagpole that needed the flag replaced. They left the wagon at the livery and walked, and Evelyn was aware in some peripheral way of how they looked. The 4 of them, Nathan in his good coat walking beside her, the children behind them, moving through a town that didn't know them and therefore couldn't have any opinions about what they were. It was a relief, actually, just 4 people walking to a courthouse to file a document. The county clerk was a small man named Whitmore, who wore spectacles and moved with the efficiency of someone who had processed more paperwork than most people had seen in their lives. And he looked at them over his glasses when they came in and said, "Rowe. Nathan Rowe, Red Bluff Ridge." "That's right," Nathan said. "Had your file pulled already?" Whitmore gestured at the bench along the wall. "Sit. Won't take long." It didn't take long. There was a document and a witness, a woman from the clerk's office whose name Evelyn didn't catch, and signatures and a fee, and then Whitmore stamped something and handed Nathan a folded paper and said, "Congratulations, I suppose," with the warmth of a man who said it 20 times a week and didn't mean it badly, just practically. Nathan folded the paper and put it in his coat. Evelyn looked at her own signature on the record and thought, that's what it takes then. 11 days on a road and 4 weeks in a house and a few minutes in a courthouse. She thought she'd feel something specific, some defined emotion that matched the significance of it. What she felt instead was something quieter, a settling, like weight redistributing itself into a more stable arrangement. Maisie, waiting on the bench, looked at Evelyn's face when they turned from the clerk's window and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," Evelyn said. Maisie stood up and took her hand the same way she'd taken it on the road 5 weeks ago, without asking. Evelyn held it and did not cry, which was an accomplishment. They ate at a restaurant in Harlan's Fork. Not a fine one, but a clean one, with tables that were wiped and a menu on a chalkboard. Nathan ordered for himself and Evelyn without asking, because she'd said she didn't know the place and would take his recommendation. And she noted that he ordered without fuss, and without performing any consideration beyond knowing what the food was likely to be good. Maisie ordered herself, with a precision that made the waiter almost smile. Thomas looked at the menu for a long time and ordered the same thing his father ordered, then immediately looked out the window as if the decision hadn't been influenced by anything at all. Evelyn watched this and said nothing, because there are moments that don't need commentary. The food came, and they ate, and outside the window Harlan's Fork went about its business. And Nathan said to no one in particular, "Weather's holding." "You said rain by afternoon," Evelyn said. "I was probably wrong." "You're allowed to be wrong," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to tell me that." "I know. I'm telling you anyway." The corner of his mouth moved. Thomas, not looking away from the window, appeared to be listening very carefully to this exchange, in the way of a child who has understood that the adults are doing something and is trying to learn the grammar of it. Maisie said, "Can I have pie?" Nathan said, "You can share a piece with Thomas." Thomas said, "I don't want pie." Nathan said, "Then Maisie can have half a piece and not complain about it." Maisie considered this arithmetic and apparently decided it was acceptable. Evelyn looked at the 4 of them around that table, the managed negotiation of it, the ordinary domestic friction, Thomas performing indifference while quietly watching the adults, Maisie's cheerful pragmatism about pie, and thought, this is the texture of it. This is what the daily life of a family looks like. Not the significant moments, the small ones, the pie negotiations and the weather predictions and the shared silences over food, and the fact that the children know how to be in this arrangement because they've been watching their father do it for years, and now they're watching to see how a new person fits into it. She was fitting, imperfectly, unevenly, with the occasional friction of 2 people learning each other's habits, but fitting. That was more than she'd known to hope for 5 weeks ago. It was on the drive home that Thomas asked his question. They were about 4 miles out of Harlan's Fork, the mountains ahead of them going in and out of the cloud cover, Maisie asleep against Evelyn's arm in the way she had of falling asleep in vehicles without warning or negotiation. Nathan was driving and Thomas was beside him, and the road was quiet except for the horses. Thomas said, "What was it like?" When you first came, before you got here. He was asking Evelyn, which she knew because he glanced back at her briefly when he said it. 11 days on a stagecoach, she said, not comfortable. Were you scared? She thought about how much truth to give him, and then decided he was a 9-year-old boy who had watched his mother die and his father grieve, and who had been assessing her every day for 4 weeks with an intelligence that deserved respect. Yes, she said, more than I admitted to myself at the time. Thomas turned that over. What were you scared of? That your father would take one look at me and decide I wasn't what he needed. Nathan, on the bench ahead of her, said nothing, but she saw the set of his shoulders change slightly. He's not like that, Thomas said. I know that now, Evelyn said. I didn't know it then. What else were you scared of? She thought about it. That the children wouldn't want me here. That I'd spend a year trying to matter to people who'd already decided I didn't. Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the road. I didn't decide that, he said finally. I know. He stopped. His jaw worked slightly, the way his father's did when he was choosing words. I needed to see what you'd do, when things were hard. That's fair, Evelyn said. Mama. He stopped on the word, and for a moment the air went tight. It was the first time Thomas had used that word for anything adjacent to Evelyn, and she could feel him deciding whether to retreat from it. He didn't retreat. He said, She used to say that you learned everything real about a person in the first hard thing, what they did when something went wrong. She sounds like she was very smart, Evelyn said carefully. She was. He said it the way his father said things, plain, direct, without ornament. She was better at some things than you. You're better at other things. I've been trying to work out which was which. It was so frank and so strange and so 9 years old that Evelyn had to take a moment. Which have you worked out? She asked. Thomas looked forward at the road. She was better at bread, he said, and at knowing when the weather was going to change. She was quieter. He paused. You're better at explaining things. And you don't get frustrated when Maisie asks too many questions. Mama got tired sometimes. He said it without judgment, the way you state a fact about someone you loved without needing them to be perfect. She had patience for other things. Everyone has patience for different things, Evelyn said. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. I think she would have liked you, he said. I've been thinking about that. Whether she would have. He turned and looked at Evelyn fully, the way he rarely did, the way he'd done only a few times since she arrived, and she saw in his face a 9-year-old trying very hard to be fair to everyone he loved simultaneously. I think she would have. She liked people who were serious about things. Evelyn held that. It was possibly the most generous thing Thomas Rowe was capable of giving her, and she understood its size. That means a great deal to me, she said, genuinely. Thomas turned back to the road. Nathan hadn't spoken through any of this, but she could see his hand on the reins, and it wasn't as loose as it usually was. After a moment, Nathan said quietly, to the road ahead, She would have liked her, Thomas. Thomas nodded. Just once. Short. Settled. Beside Evelyn, Maisie slept on, entirely absent from, and somehow central to all of it. That night, after the children were in bed, Evelyn went to the room at the end of the hall and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, not quite thinking, and not quite not thinking. The dried wildflower was still in the tin cup on the table. She'd left it there through everything, through 4 weeks of the room becoming hers in small incremental ways. Her books on the shelf, her mending basket in the corner, her coat on the hook behind the door. The room was no longer a room someone had set up for a stranger. It was her room, in the way that spaces become yours through the accumulation of ordinary use. She heard Nathan come down the hall and stop at her doorway. She'd left it open, which she'd started doing about 2 weeks in, without consciously deciding to. You're awake, he said. Just sitting. He leaned against the doorframe. This was new, him stopping here, at the end of the day, instead of going directly to his room at the other end of the hall. It had started 3 or 4 days ago, just briefly, a check-in that wasn't quite a check-in, just a presence at the end of the day. Thomas talked more today than he has since before Clara died, Nathan said. I know. I've been trying to get him to say what he had in his head for 14 months. He looked at the floor, then up. He said it to you on a wagon ride. He was ready, Evelyn said. It wasn't about me. It was partly about you. She didn't argue with that. Nathan was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working toward something, the way he worked toward things, deliberately, without hurrying himself. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to hear it as separate from today, separate from the courthouse. I need you to hear it as just the truth of the thing. She waited. When Clara was dying, he said, she said something to me. She said she needed me to promise to let someone else in eventually. I told her she was wrong about what she was thinking, that I wasn't going to. He stopped, and the muscle in his jaw worked. She knew me well enough to know I'd close up, that I'd manage the children and the ranch, and I'd get through it, and I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. He looked at the window. Her window, the west-facing one, dark now. She was right. That's what I was doing. Right up until you got off that stage, looking like you'd been through everything and still weren't going to apologize for it. Evelyn sat very still. I'd been protecting myself for 14 months, he said. And then you fixed the window latch and made Thomas feel like himself at the table and sat in the garden and said grief doesn't get fixed. It just gets company. And he shook his head. I couldn't stay closed off from that. I didn't want to. Nathan, she said, I'm not finished. He wasn't saying it to cut her off. He said it because he'd started and he needed to get through it. I know I'm not easy. I know I don't say things in the right order or at the right time. I know I probably won't change that much. He looked at her. But I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. What you did, coming here like you did, staying, the way you've been with the children, none of it. She stood up from this bed and crossed the room and stopped in front of him, close enough that this was a different kind of conversation than the ones they'd been having in kitchens and barns and across tables. I know you don't take it lightly, she said. You're not a man who takes things lightly. No, he said, and I know you're not easy. I knew that from the letters. And you came anyway. I came anyway. He looked at her, and in the dim light of the doorway, she could see the exhaustion in him and the thing underneath the exhaustion that wasn't exhaustion at all. The same thing she'd been watching build in him for 4 weeks, careful and honest and real. I'm not going to be Clara, she said. I can't be, and I wouldn't try. She was here first in this house with these children, and that's not something I can replace, and I'm not trying to. I know that, but I can be Evelyn Rowe, she said, and I think Evelyn Rowe is someone worth being in this house, with these children, with you. He put his hand up and touched her face, just his thumb against her cheek, briefly, the way a man touches something he's afraid of damaging. She put her hand over his and held it there for a moment. I think so too, he said, rough and quiet and entirely meant. They stood there in the doorway of the room with the west window, and outside the night had cleared, the clouds Nathan had predicted gone somewhere else. The sky doing what Colorado skies did when they weren't being difficult, putting up more stars than any reasonable sky needed, indifferent and enormous and quietly magnificent. Tomorrow the ranch would need all of them. The cattle, the garden, the teaching, the mending, the bread that Thomas had fairly noted she made better than average. All of the ordinary machinery of a life that had been built from necessity and was becoming something else. But tonight was the doorway, the pause between what things had been and what they were going to be, and both of them were standing in it, which was enough. The morning after the courthouse, Evelyn woke before the stove needed feeding and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the house. It had a sound, this house, that she'd learned the way you learn a person's habits, not all at once, but in accumulated small observations until the pattern becomes familiar enough to notice when it changes. The particular creak of the third floorboard in the hall when Nathan passed it on his way to the kitchen. The way the east wall ticked in the cold before dawn. The muffled thump from Maisie's room that meant she'd rolled against the wall in her sleep. All of it had been strange once, and now none of it was. And that shift had happened so gradually she couldn't have named the day it occurred. She got up and dressed and went to the kitchen, and Nathan was already there, which had become the pattern. The two of them in the early dark before the children, the stove between them and the coffee, and the day assembling itself around them. He looked up when she came in and handed her a cup without speaking, and she took it and stood by the window and looked out at the yard going from black to gray in the early light. You sleep? He asked. Some, she said. Enough. He nodded. He was at the table with his own cup, looking at something outside that she couldn't see from where she stood. After a moment, he said, I was thinking last night. After. After what? He looked at her with the expression that had replaced the careful composure he'd shown her in the first week. Still not effusive, still very much Nathan Rowe, but more readable than before. After our conversation, in the doorway. She waited. I've been doing something wrong, he said. Not wrong exactly. I don't know the right word. He put his cup down and turned it with his fingers, the way he did when he was working toward something. I've been running this ranch and raising the children, and I've been managing. That's the word. Managing everything. Keeping it all from falling apart. He paused. And what that means is I've been alone in my own house for 14 months because managing is something you do by yourself. Evelyn said nothing because he wasn't finished. You can't manage with someone else, he said. You can only manage around them, or you can... He looked for it. You can share it. The two things feel the same from the outside, but they're not. No, she said. They're not. I've been managing around you, he said. I've been grateful for what you do and aware of how different the house is. And I've been... He shook his head. I haven't been sharing it. I've been watching you carry half of something and thanking you for it instead of... He stopped. I want to do it differently. Evelyn looked at this man who communicated in slow and deliberate excavations, who got to the true thing eventually but needed to dig for it, and she thought about what Thomas had said on the wagon ride. You learn everything real about a person in the first hard thing. She thought Nathan Rowe's hard thing had been the last 14 months, and what she was watching right now was what was on the other side of it. You can start this morning, she said. No ceremony required. He looked at her for a moment, and what was on his face was something she thought he probably hadn't worn in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the precondition of it, the opening. All right, he said. Maisie came out 40 minutes later in her socks and her nightgown and announced that she had dreamed about a horse that could talk, and it had said something very important, but she couldn't remember what. What did its voice sound like? Evelyn asked, because with Maisie, the follow-up question was always the better one. Maisie thought about it with great seriousness. Like Papa but smaller, she said. Nathan, at the stove, made a sound that was absolutely a suppressed laugh. Thomas came out shortly after, dressed and with his hair done, and poured himself water and stood against the wall in the way he'd developed of being present without requiring acknowledgement, which Evelyn had stopped trying to change and started simply working around, giving him the space to come to the table on his own timeline, which he always did. He sat down and looked at the two of them, and then said without preamble, Something's different. We had a conversation this morning, Evelyn said. Thomas looked from her to his father and back. A good one? A useful one, Nathan said. Thomas appeared to find this acceptable. He picked up his fork. Maisie said her dream horse sounded like you, he said to his father. I heard, Nathan said. That's strange. Most things Maisie dreams are strange. That's fair, Thomas said, and ate his breakfast, and the morning moved through itself in the way of ordinary mornings, which was the most extraordinary thing Evelyn could think of. The real work of it happened across the following weeks, in the incremental and imperfect way that real work happens, not in revelations or dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small decisions made differently than they would have been made before. Nathan started telling her things. Not the big things first, those came later, but the daily operational things, the state of the cattle, and the condition of the south fence, and what Breckett down the trail had said about the water table. He told her not as reports, but as conversations, with the genuine expectation of her response, and she gave it, and what they were doing without naming it was building the shared language of running a life together. She started telling him things, too, about the children, Thomas's reading, which had outpaced what she'd expected and needed a different approach. Maisie's arithmetic, which was stronger than her patience for it. A conversation she'd had with Maisie about Clara that she'd handled in the moment but wanted his perspective on, after. That one happened on a Tuesday, about 3 weeks after the courthouse. Maisie had come in from the yard and found Evelyn in the kitchen and said, with the directness that was simply how Maisie was built, "Do you think about your husband? Your first one?" Evelyn had set down what she was doing. Sometimes, she said. Why? I think about Mama sometimes and I feel bad, Maisie said, like I'm not supposed to. Why would you not be supposed to? Maisie looked at her hands. Because now you're here. Evelyn crouched down to Maisie's eye level, the way she'd done with children her whole teaching life. So the conversation was between people and not from a height down to a child. Maisie, she said, thinking about your mama is not a wrong thing. It will never be a wrong thing. She was your mama, and she always will be, and nothing changes that. Even with you here? Especially with me here, Evelyn said. Your mama was here first, and she loved you, and she was real, and remembering her is that's just love. That's what love does. It stays. Maisie looked at her with her 6-year-old face that was always slightly too serious for 6 years old. Do you miss your husband? Yes, Evelyn said. And I'm also happy to be here. Both things are true at the same time. Maisie thought about this for a long moment. Then she put her arms around Evelyn's neck and held on in the fierce and uncomplicated way she had, and Evelyn held on back, and that was the whole of it. She told Nathan that evening, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat with it for a moment before he said, That was the right thing, what you said. I wasn't sure in the moment. It was right. He paused. She's been needing someone to tell her that for a while, that it isn't a betrayal to remember, and also be glad. Have you told her? He looked at her. I didn't know how. You would have found it, she said. You find the things that matter. You just take the long way around. He made a sound that was self-aware enough to count as honest. Clara used to say the same thing. She knew you, Evelyn said. She did. He was quiet for a moment. You're starting to. She looked at him. I think I am. The town settled down by June. Not because anyone changed their minds entirely. Mrs. Aldrich would go to her grave convinced she'd had reasonable concerns, and Garrett Hale would continue being pleasant in his professional way. But because time and visible evidence have a way of answering questions that argument can't. The Rowe household was stable. The children looked well. Nathan looked less like a man barely holding something together and more like a man who had been given back something he'd thought was gone. People notice that, even if they don't say it directly. The settlement adjusted around the fact of Evelyn Rowe, the way communities adjust around established things. And by midsummer, she was teaching 2 other children from neighboring farms in the mornings, along with Thomas and Maisie, which had started because Mrs. Breckett had asked tentatively and Evelyn had said yes, because usefulness was still the frame she understood herself through, and because she liked children and liked teaching and saw no reason to hold those things back. The school question was Nathan's idea formally. He raised it one evening in July, when the heat had pushed them both out to the porch after supper, the children inside, the ranch going quiet around them. There are 7 children in range of Red Bluff Ridge who aren't getting proper schooling, he said. I know, Evelyn said. She'd been doing the same count. The settlement should have a proper schoolhouse. He looked out at the yard. I've been talking to a few of the men, Breckett and the Haverford brothers. There's the will to build it if there's someone to teach in it. She looked at him. You want me to run a school? I think you should run a school, he said. I think you're wasting yourself on 2 children and a vegetable garden. She surprised herself by laughing. Genuinely laughing, the unself-conscious kind. And Nathan looked at her with that almost smile that had become one of the things she looked forward to daily. It's not a waste, she said. You know what I mean. I do. She settled back in her chair. A schoolhouse would take time to build. Fall, maybe, before the cold. She looked at the yard, the mountains beyond, the land that had been strange to her and was strange no longer. She thought about the woman in the general store saying she's an Ohio schoolteacher. That's not the same as... And she thought that actually the woman had been right. It wasn't the same, but not in the way the woman had meant. She wasn't that schoolteacher anymore. She was someone else. Made from the same materials but rearranged by 11 days on a road and 5 months in a house with people who needed her and a man who had told her the truth in a barn. All right, she said, let's build a school. Nathan nodded, satisfied, and that was how that decision was made. On a porch in the July heat, without ceremony, like most of the real decisions they made. Thomas turned 10 in August. He asked for a fishing trip, just him and Nathan, which he'd apparently been working up to asking for weeks. And Nathan said yes immediately, which was the right answer, even though it meant a full day away from the ranch and a heavy work period, because some things are the right answer regardless of the inconvenience. They left before dawn and came back in the late afternoon with 6 fish and Thomas sunburned across his nose, and Thomas was talking when they came through the door, actually talking, in the continuous unprompted way he almost never did, about the spot they'd found and what the water was doing, and some theory he'd developed about fish behavior that was probably partly right and partly 10-year-old extrapolation. Nathan caught Evelyn's eye over Thomas's head, and what was on his face was a fullness she hadn't seen in him before. Something restored. She made the fish for dinner, and Thomas told Maisie about the trip with a patience for her questions that he usually didn't have. And Maisie listened with an attention she usually didn't provide. And the dinner was loud in the way that the Row kitchen almost never was. Overlapping voices and Maisie knocking over her water and Thomas's ongoing fish theory, and Nathan eating quietly in the middle of it with an expression that was, finally, unmistakably, the face of a man who was not managing his life, but living it. After the children were in bed, Evelyn washed dishes and Nathan dried them, which had become the evening pattern, one of the dozen small routines they'd built without designing them. "He's going to be all right," Nathan said. He wasn't asking. "He already is," Evelyn said. "He's been all right for a while. He was just waiting to be sure the ground was solid before he moved around on it." Nathan looked at the dish in his hands. "That's what I did too," he said, "for most of my life." "I know," she said. "I learned it from watching him." He set the dish in the stack and picked up another, and she heard the smile in his voice even without seeing it. "You figured me out through my son. You're not hard to figure out," she said. "You're just slow." Clara said that too. She was right. He laughed then. Actually laughed. The real kind, which she'd heard only a handful of times, which made it something she saved and turned over afterward like a stone with an unexpected weight. The kitchen held the sound of it for a moment before it settled back into the ordinary quiet. She handed him the last dish and dried her hands, and he set it in the rack and leaned against the counter and looked at her. "Are you glad?" he said. Still, after all of it, she thought about what she'd told him in the barn those months ago. "Give me a little more time, and I'll be glad too." She thought about the 11 days on the road, and the first night in the room with the west window, and Maisie's hand in hers, and Thomas on the wagon saying she would have liked you. She thought about the courthouse, and the morning after, and every ordinary difficult day between then and now. "Yes," she said, without qualification. He looked at her with that face that she had learned to read and would spend the rest of her life still learning, and he reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. A small gesture, domestic, unperformed, and said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. Quote. The blue dress was still at the bottom of the bag. She found it in September, going through her things to make room for the coat she'd need once the cold came in earnest. She lifted it out and looked at it in the afternoon light from the west window. The tear along the right seam where the branch had caught it, the hem still stained from the flooded trail on the second day, the fabric that had once been the best thing she owned and was now just a dress that had been through something. She didn't throw it away. She didn't put it back at the bottom either. She took it to her mending basket. The tear was sewn back together in 40 minutes. The hem she couldn't fully restore. The stain was in the fabric itself now, had been too long, but she cleaned what could be cleaned and pressed it flat. When she held it up against herself in the small mirror on the washstand, it didn't look new. It looked like a dress that had lived. She hung it on the hook behind the door. Maisie found it there the next morning, on her way in to wake Evelyn up in the particular forceful way she had, and stopped and looked at it. "That's a pretty dress," she said. "Is it special?" "In a way," Evelyn said. "Why?" She looked at the blue dress on the hook, patched and stained and pressed flat, still itself despite everything that had happened to it. "Because I was wearing it when I decided to come here," she said. "When I got on the stage in Ohio and started the trip, I was wearing that dress. I had it on when I arrived." Maisie studied it with the seriousness she brought to things she found worth considering. "It got hurt," she said, touching the mended seam. "The road was hard," Evelyn said. "It did the best it could." Maisie looked at her then with those eyes that saw more than a 6-year-old had any business seeing. "Like you," she said. Evelyn pulled her daughter. She thought the word, simply and without qualification, her daughter, into her arms and held her in the morning light. "Like me," she said. "There are things you don't understand about yourself until you're on the other side of them. You don't know what you're capable of carrying until you have to carry it. You don't know whether you can stay until you've had a real reason to leave and chosen not to. And you don't know whether a life built from necessity can become something chosen, genuinely, freely, without reservation, until you've lived enough of it to look back and see what it actually is." What Evelyn Rowe had learned across 11 days of bad road and 5 months in a house that was not hers until it was that the bravest thing was not the leaving. It was not boarding the stage in Ohio with her good dress on and her trunk packed and her letter folded in her pocket. That was courage, but it was the easier kind, the kind that comes from having nothing left where you are. The braver thing was the staying, was choosing every ordinary morning to be present in a life that was difficult and unglamorous and full of other people's grief alongside her own, and to call that life hers. Nathan came to the doorway of the room and looked at the two of them, and looked at the blue dress on the hook, and looked at Evelyn with a question on his face. "Old dress," she said. "I remember it," he said. "You were wearing it when you arrived." She looked at him. "You noticed." "I noticed everything's about that day," he said. "I just didn't know what to do with most of it yet." She smiled at him, fully, without reservation, the kind of smile that doesn't perform anything because it doesn't need to. He smiled back, his version of it, quiet and real and entirely meant. Maisie extracted herself from Evelyn's arms and went to her father and took his hand and pulled him toward the kitchen with the authority of a child who had decided breakfast was overdue. And Nathan went, complaining mildly about being dragged, and Evelyn heard Thomas's voice from down the hall asking what all the noise was, and the house filled up with the sounds of mourning. She stood in the room with the west window for one more moment. The light was coming in at the angle she knew. Gold on the pine floor, the mountains outside going from shadow to detail as the sun cleared the ridge. The tin cup on the table still held the dried wildflower that Maisie had put there the day she arrived, still there after everything. She'd been a widow and a traveler and a stranger in a place that didn't know her. She'd been afraid and exhausted and uncertain and determined by turns, and none of those things had been tidy or sequential or resolved on any particular day. What she was now was Evelyn Rowe of Red Bluff Ridge, Colorado Territory, schoolteacher and rancher's wife and mother to 2 children who had not started out hers and were hers now in every way that mattered. Not because a document in Harlan's Fork said so, because she had shown up every day and stayed. That was the whole of it. That was also everything. She went to join her family for breakfast.